Stacy Castor. She was called the Black Widow of Onondaga County, and the name stuck for a reason. 2 husbands, 2 strange deaths, and a daughter who was meant to take the blame for both. Stacy Castor was born in 1967 in Clay, New York, and married her first husband, Michael Wallace, in 1990. They had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree. By late 1999, Wallace began feeling ill, suffering vomiting, unsteadiness, and swelling. He died in January 2000. Castor refused his sister's request for an autopsy, and doctors recorded the death as a heart attack. The case was closed before it had really begun. In 2003, she married David Castor and took the surname she would carry into a courtroom. She worked as the office manager of his heating and cooling business, Liverpool Heating and Air Conditioning. To neighbors, the marriage looked ordinary. So how did it end the same way the first one had? On the morning of August 22, 2005, Castor called emergency services saying David had locked himself in their bedroom. Police forced the door. They found him dead, with a green liquid on the nightstand and an open antifreeze container under the bed. At first glance, it looked like a man who had taken his own life. But the scene did not hold together. The details refused to line up. Castor's fingerprints, not David's, were on the glass. A turkey baster carrying both antifreeze and David's DNA was found in the kitchen trash. Prosecutors came to believe she had forced the poison into him with that baster over a 4-day weekend. If David had wanted to end his own life, why would the evidence point so clearly back to her? Once detectives doubted the second death, they reopened the first. Michael Wallace's body was exhumed in 2007, and toxicology confirmed antifreeze poisoning. 2 husbands, the same method, the same widow standing beside both graves. Then came the part that turned a murder case into something far darker. In September 2007, detectives told Ashley on her first day of college that her father had been poisoned. Soon after, Castor invited her daughter home for a drink. Over the next 17 hours, Castor gave Ashley sleeping pills, then a mixture of alcohol and crushed prescription medication through a straw. She then planted a typed note made to look like a confession to both deaths. The plan was simple and cruel. If Ashley did not survive, the note would speak for her. It was Bree who broke the plan apart. Bree found her sister unresponsive and insisted that help be called. Castor herself made the emergency call. Ashley survived. And the moment she survived, the entire frame began to collapse. Why? Because the note could be traced. The supposed confession was found on the family computer and time-stamped while Ashley was at school. And there was one more detail no jury could ignore. In the note, the word antifreeze was misspelled as anti-free 4 times, matching a slip Castor herself had made during a police interview. The writer of that note was sitting in the interview room, not lying in a hospital bed. When ABC's David Muir later asked Castor about her daughter, she suggested that kids do things like that. Ashley recovered, and she testified. She told the court she had not written the note and had not killed anyone. The daughter Castor had chosen as a scapegoat became the witness who ended her. Castor's trial began in January 2009 in Onondaga County. On February 5, 2009, the jury found her guilty of the second-degree murder of David Castor, the attempted murder of Ashley, and forging David's will. She was sentenced in March 2009 to 51 1/3 years to life. She would not serve all of it. Castor was found dead in her cell at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in June 2016. Officials concluded she died of a heart attack, with no foul play involved. But the next case moves from a quiet poisoning to a sudden act of violence, and from a daughter who survived to a parent who chose to hand in their own. Paul Dyson. He cried on television. He searched alongside her family. He told everyone her disappearance was completely out of character. So why was the person who finally turned him in someone from inside his own home? Paul Dyson was a nightclub doorman in Hull, England, engaged to Joanne Nelson. He had earlier convictions, including harming his former wife. His own father was a convicted murderer, a detail that would later sit heavily over the case and over the way people understood him. In February 2005, at the couple's home on Hotham Road North in West Hull, Dyson strangled 22-year-old Joanne Nelson following an argument about housework. What he did next was calculated. According to Hull Live, he wrapped her body, placed it in his car, and drove to Woodland in Bransby, near York, about 100 miles from their home. He even stopped in Howden to refuel along the way. Then he went home and built a story. That same night, Dyson reported Joanne missing and said her disappearance was completely out of character. In the days that followed, he did everything a worried partner would do. He joined door-to-door searches with her family and gave tearful appeals on television. To the public, he looked like a man falling apart. He stood among the people who loved Joanne and searched the streets for a woman he already knew would never be found. How long can a person keep up a performance like that? Behind the cameras, the performance had a crack in it. Dyson made one mistake, and it was a human one. He confided what he had done to a close friend. That friend did not stay silent. The friend told Dyson's mother, Christine. And here the case turns on a decision very few parents are ever asked to make. According to reporting on the case, Dyson's mother was the one who eventually handed him to police, going to them with what she knew after learning what her son had done. The man searching the streets for Joanne was given up by the woman who raised him. One newspaper headline at the time captured it plainly, reporting that Joanne's killer faced life after his mother turned him in. Joanne Nelson's body was found about 6 weeks after she was killed in March 2005. A post-mortem examination confirmed she had been strangled. The woods near York gave up the truth that Dyson's televised tears had tried to bury. The case against him was strong, and he seemed to know it. Dyson pleaded guilty on the first day of his trial at Hull Crown Court in November 2005. There would be no drawn-out fight over the facts. What the judge said at sentencing cut straight through the public performance. Dyson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. The judge told him he had lost his temper and ended the life of a young woman he claimed to love, and that he had then gone on television and displayed what the judge called nauseating hypocrisy. Prosecutors had described those same appeals in similar terms, calling them stomach-churning. So what happened to Paul Dyson after the cameras moved on? The years that followed brought a slow and, for Joanne's family, painful release. In October 2019, he was moved to an open prison over the objections of her family. In January 2022, the parole board directed his release, and he was freed in early 2022 after serving just over 17 years. He remains on license, a condition that can follow him for the rest of his life, and that can return him to prison if broken. A friend spoke, a mother acted, and a story carefully built for television came apart in a single conversation. The next case is also a story of a long silence finally broken. But the person who ended it did not pick up a phone. She did not even know she was a witness. Dennis Rader. He led a church congregation. He worked in home security. For more than 30 years, he hid behind 3 letters, BTK. And in the end, it was a routine medical record belonging to his own daughter that exposed him. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 in Kansas. He served in the Air Force, worked installing alarm systems for a security company, and earned a criminal justice degree from Wichita State. He married Paula Dietz in 1971, and they had 2 children, a son and a daughter named Carrie. He served as president of his church council and as a Cub Scout leader. On paper, he was the most ordinary man on his street. But Rader had built a second identity in plain sight. Between 1974 and 1991, he killed at least 10 people in Sedgwick County, Kansas. The first attack, in January 1974, claimed 4 members of the Otero family in Wichita. Over the years that followed, his victims included Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, a neighbor named Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerle, and Dolores Davis. He sent letters to police and to the media, signing them BTK, a name that stood for the way he worked. Then, after the final killing in 1991, the letters stopped. For 13 years, the case went quiet, and many in Wichita assumed the man behind the name was gone, dead, or jailed for something else. Why would someone who craved attention suddenly fall silent for over a decade, only to return? In 2004, that is exactly what happened. And Rader began contacting the media again, taunting the city he had frightened for a generation. His need to be noticed became the thread that unraveled him. In February 2005, Rader sent a computer disk to a local television station. Before sending it, he asked police, through a message, whether a disk could be traced back to him. Police answered with a classified ad telling him it was safe. It was not. Forensic data on the disk showed the file had last been changed by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. Rader was the president of that very congregation. The name on the disk and the name on the church directory were the same. Investigators now had a strong suspect. What they needed was proof. And the proof came from a place no one could have predicted. Here is the part of the case that sets it apart from almost every other. Police obtained a search warrant for the medical records of Rader's daughter, Carrie, who was then a student at Kansas State University. From a routine medical exam, they took a tissue sample. The DNA from that sample was a family match to DNA recovered from under one victim's fingernails. It proved that the father of that sample was the killer. Carrie had not testified. She had not made a call. She had simply existed, and her own biology pointed directly at her father. Dennis Rader was arrested in February 2005. He pleaded guilty in June 2005, describing each killing in a flat, clinical manner that stunned the courtroom. In August 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, with no chance of parole for 175 years. What happens to a family that learns the truth this way? Rader, now in his 80s, is held at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, in protective segregation. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, went in a different direction entirely. She became a victims' rights advocate, published a memoir about her experience, and was featured in a 2025 documentary about her father. The renewed attention has even pushed investigators to look again at older unsolved cases in other states, including a 1976 disappearance in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. As of recent reporting, those inquiries remain open and unresolved. A daughter who never knew she was a witness still became the one piece of evidence her father could not control. The next case stretches an investigation across decades in several states. And once again, it took a grown child, looking back, to see the pattern no one else could. Edward Wayne Edwards. He once sat on a television panel show as a reformed criminal. He wrote a book about turning his life around. He played the part of a changed man for decades. So what made his own daughter start digging into the towns where she grew up? Edward Wayne Edwards was born in 1933 in Akron, Ohio. His early life was difficult, and as a young man, he carried out a string of gas station robberies that placed him on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1961. He was captured in Atlanta in January 1962. Then Edwards did something unusual. After his release, he rebranded himself as a reformed criminal, became a motivational speaker, appeared on the panel show To Tell the Truth, and published an autobiography. He married, and he and his wife had 5 children, the eldest of whom was April. To the public, he was proof that people could change. But what was happening in the towns his family kept leaving behind? The answer was a trail of unsolved killings. In August 1977, a young couple, William Lavaco and Judith Straub, were shot in Silver Creek Metro Park in Norton, Ohio. In August 1980, another young couple, Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, vanished after a wedding reception at the Concord House in Watertown, Wisconsin, a venue where Edwards worked as caretaker. Their bodies were later found, and the case became known as the Sweetheart Murders. For years, those cases sat cold. Edwards kept moving, kept speaking, kept performing his story of redemption in front of audiences who had no idea who was standing in front of them. How does a man stay free for over 3 decades while unsolved cases follow him from town to town? He did not count on his own daughter. In 2009, April Balascio, Edwards' adult daughter, began researching unsolved cases in the towns where her family had suddenly relocated during her childhood. She had carried a memory for years. As she later described it, wherever the family lived, there were dead bodies, and someone was always killed wherever they lived. One memory stood out. She recalled the family leaving Watertown, Wisconsin in a hurry, right around the time the young couple went missing in 1980. So she made a phone call. Balascio contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Wisconsin and gave them her tip. That call reopened everything. Detectives matched newly tested DNA from evidence in the Hack and Drew case to Edwards. He was arrested in July 2009 in Louisville, Kentucky. The reformed man, the panel show guest, the published author, was a serial killer. And the person who pointed police toward him was the child who had grown up watching the family run. She had spent her childhood inside the story, and as an adult, she was the only one who could read it. What happened once he was caught surprised even investigators. In June 2010, Edwards pleaded guilty to the Ohio and Wisconsin killings and received 2 life sentences. Then he went further. He volunteered a confession to another killing, that of his foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, whom he had lured away and shot for a life insurance payout. He told the Associated Press that he wanted to be sentenced to death. In March 2011, a panel of 3 judges sentenced him to death by lethal injection. He would never reach an execution date. Edwards died of natural causes in April 2011 in an Ohio prison medical center before his scheduled execution. His daughter April went on to write about her experience and became the central voice of a podcast about the case. Investigators have continued to weigh whether other unsolved cases belong to him as well. A man spent 30 years performing the role of someone who had changed. It took his own daughter, quietly tracing the map of her childhood, to prove the performance was a lie. The next case also begins inside a family. But here the truth was buried so deep that it took years and a television tip line before anyone would believe the person trying to tell it. Teresa Knorr. 2 of her daughters were found in remote parts of California, unidentified for years. The people who knew what had happened were her own children, and one of them spent years trying to make someone, anyone, listen. Teresa Knorr was born in 1946 in Sacramento, California. She married 4 times and had 6 children. After her final divorce, her household grew increasingly troubled and she became reclusive. Behind the closed doors of that home, life had become something her children would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to the outside world. The case centers on 2 of her daughters, Suisun and Sheila. Suisun died in 1984, and her body was left in a wooded area near Olympic Valley, then known as Squaw Valley. Sheila died in 1985, and her body was placed in a box and left near Truckee, California. For years, both went unidentified. To investigators, they were 2 separate cases. 2 young women found in the California landscape with no names attached to them. No one connected them to each other, and no one connected them to a single house in Sacramento. Who would finally close that gap? The answer was the youngest daughter, Terry. Terry had escaped the family home as a teenager. She knew what had happened to her sisters, but knowing was not the same as being heard. This is the part of the case that is hardest to absorb. Terry tried to tell people. Her account was repeatedly dismissed, even by those who should have helped her. Imagine carrying the truth about your own family and watching adult after adult wave it away. How many times can a person be disbelieved before they stop speaking at all? Terry did not stop. In October 1993, she saw a segment on the television program America's Most Wanted and called its tip line. She told them that the unidentified women found near Truckee and Olympic Valley were her sisters. This time, someone wrote it down. This time, someone checked. Placer County investigators believed her and began to build the case. The physical evidence started to line up with Terry's account. Fingerprints connected to the box found near Truckee tied her brothers to the disposal of Sheila's body. What had been 2 anonymous cases became one family story. And the woman at the center of it all was not hard to find once police were finally looking. Teresa Knorr was located in Salt Lake City, where she had been living and working under her maiden name, Cross. The family itself became the case. Teresa's son William confessed and agreed to testify against his mother as part of a plea arrangement. Her son Robert, who was already serving a sentence in Nevada for a separate killing, initially denied involvement before pleading guilty. The children who had lived through it all became the witnesses who closed it. Teresa Knorr was charged in November 1993. At first, she pleaded not guilty, but the case against her was built from the inside, and that changed everything. What does a parent do when their own children are prepared to take the stand? After learning that her son Robert would testify, Knorr pleaded guilty in October 1995 to avoid a possible death sentence. She received 2 consecutive life sentences. Her son William was given probation and counseling, and Robert received an additional concurrent sentence. Where are they now? Teresa Knorr, now in her 80s, is held at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She has been denied parole more than once, including in 2019, 2024, and again in 2025. Robert was released in 2013. William has since rebuilt his life and has spoken publicly about the case. And Terry, the daughter who refused to be silenced, did not live to see old age. Terry died of a heart attack in 2011. 2 unidentified women were given their names back because a sister kept talking long after the world had stopped listening. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case moves from a household no one could see into to a home that looked, from the outside, like the picture of stability. and a father whose disappearance lasted almost 2 decades. John List. He canceled the milk. He canceled the mail. He set the lights low and left organ music playing on a loop. Then John List walked out of his own home and vanished for 18 years. John List was born in 1925 in Bay City, Michigan. He was a wartime Army veteran and a certified public accountant who rose to become a vice president and comptroller at a bank. He was a devout churchgoer, a Sunday school teacher, and a scout leader. He lived with his family in Breeze Knoll, a large Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey. To anyone driving past, the List household looked secure. So what was happening behind that front door that no neighbor ever saw? The truth was financial collapse. List had been secretly out of work for months after his bank position was eliminated. Each morning, he still left the house and went to the train station, keeping up the appearance of a man heading to the office. He could not face what his family would think if they knew. And so, rather than tell them, he made a decision that is almost impossible to comprehend. On November 9, 1971, John List took the lives of all 5 members of his family. His victims were his wife, Helen, his elderly mother, Alma, and his 3 children, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. He had reasoned, in his own troubled logic, that he was sparing them from a future of hardship. What he did afterward showed a chilling level of planning. He laid the bodies of the 4 younger family members on sleeping bags in the ballroom of the mansion. He canceled the household deliveries, turned the heat down low, and set the home intercom to play organ music. He wrote a long confession addressed to his church pastor, then drove to an airport and disappeared. For nearly a month, no one knew. The bodies were not discovered until December 7, 1971. By then, John List was already gone, somewhere in a country of 200 million people. How do you find a man who has had a month's head start in a brand new name? For 18 years, you do not. List built an entirely new life under the name Robert Clark. He settled in Colorado, joined a church, and remarried in 1985. He later moved to Virginia and worked again as an accountant. The man who had erased his family had, in a sense, erased himself too. The case went cold and stayed cold. Then television reopened it. In May 1989, the program America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the List case, featuring a clay bust of how the fugitive might look after nearly 2 decades. The sculpture, made by forensic artist Frank Bender, proved remarkably accurate. A former neighbor recognized the face. A woman named Wanda Flannery, who had once lived near List in Colorado, called the show's tip line. That tip led police straight to him. List was arrested at his accounting office in Richmond, Virginia, just 10 days after the broadcast. Fingerprints taken from his old Army records confirmed who he really was, and he conceded his identity in early 1990. The new name was gone. Robert Clark was John List again. The List case sits slightly apart from the others here. His capture turned not on a surviving child or a family member's call, but on a community member recognizing a televised forensic sculpture. Yet the case became the defining example of the kind of family tragedy that programs like America's Most Wanted were built to solve. And it is for that reason grouped alongside the others. List was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder in 1990. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, which left him ineligible for release for well over a century. The defense argued a midlife breakdown brought on by financial pressure, while prosecutors described a cold and deliberate plan. John List died in 2008, of complications from pneumonia while in custody in New Jersey. He was 82, a man who spent 18 years as someone else spent his final years answering, at last, for who he had been. The next case carries a similar weight, a parent accused of erasing a family. But this story turns on a courtroom and a defense that the jury refused to accept. Christian Longo. He was on the run in Mexico under another man's name when the FBI finally found him. And in an Oregon courtroom, Christian Longo tried to hand the blame to someone who could no longer speak. Christian Longo was born in 1974 and raised in Michigan. He married young, and by the time of the case, he was working at a coffee shop in Newport, Oregon, while his wife, Mary Jane, cared for their family. The family had relocated to Oregon in 2001, leaving behind a trail of bad checks and forgery in the Midwest. The move was meant to be a fresh start. It was, instead, the last chapter. In December 2001, Mary Jane Longo and the couple's 3 children were killed. Their bodies were placed in the waters around Newport, Oregon, and were discovered over the days that followed. A young family, gone in a single stretch of December. And the husband and father at the center of it was nowhere to be found. Where does a man go after something like this? Longo fled to Mexico, traveling under the stolen identity of a writer for a national magazine. He was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He was captured at a resort area in Mexico and taken into United States custody in January 2002. On the flight back, he reportedly told an agent that he had sent his family to a better place. The borrowed name had run out. The case then moved to a courtroom in Lincoln County. And what happened there is the reason the Longo name is still discussed today. At trial in 2003, Longo testified and claimed that Mary Jane had been responsible for the deaths of 2 of the children. It was a defense that placed the blame on the one person who could not answer it. Would a jury believe a man pointing at his own wife from the witness stand? They would not. The jury rejected his account and convicted him of all 4 killings. In April 2003, after deliberating for several hours, the jury recommended a death sentence, and the judge imposed it. The judge told Longo that the jury had seen through his story, just as the court had. Longo's case is unusual on this list because there was no surviving child to testify. There was no relative who made the decisive call. He is here because the entire case was a family erased by a parent trying to escape his own circumstances. The same pattern that runs through the list story, and others like it. The evidence at the scene, the flight to Mexico, and the borrowed identity did the work that a witness might otherwise have done. And the jury weighed all of it against the story he told from the stand. What happened to him after the sentence? For years, Longo sat on Oregon's death row. Then, in December 2022, the governor of Oregon commuted the sentences of everyone on the state's death row to life in prison without the possibility of release. For Mary Jane's family, the decision was difficult to accept, and her sister called it devastating. Christian Longo remains in prison at the Oregon State Penitentiary. While incarcerated, he founded an organization in 2011 arguing that death row inmates should be allowed to donate organs. He will not face execution, but he will not leave prison either. The next case also reached its turning point in a courtroom. But here the witness was a child who had survived, and whose words changed everything. Diane Downs. She drove slowly to the hospital with a story about a stranger on a dark country road. But the smallest witness in the case would later say 4 words that no defense could survive. Diane Downs was born in 1955 in Phoenix, Arizona. She worked as a postal carrier in Oregon and was a mother of 3. At the time of the case, she was involved with a married co-worker who, according to investigation discovery, did not want children and had told her he would not be a father to her children. That relationship would sit at the center of everything investigators came to believe about her motive. It was, in their view, the pressure that set the night of May 19th in motion. On the night of May 19th, 1983, Downs arrived at a hospital in Springfield, Oregon, with her 3 children, all of whom had been shot. She had a wound on her own arm. She told police that a stranger had stopped her car on a rural road and attacked the family. It was a story designed to make her a victim too. But almost immediately, the details began to work against her. Hospital staff noticed how calm she seemed in the aftermath. A witness reported that Downs had driven to the hospital unusually slowly, at a crawl. For a mother racing to save her children, the pace made no sense. Why would someone in genuine panic drive that slowly toward help? The physical evidence deepened those doubts. Investigators found no footprints from any stranger at the scene. Ballistics pointed toward a weapon connected to Downs herself. Investigators were further troubled by her conduct in the months before trial. The bushy-haired stranger she had described was beginning to look like someone who had never existed at all. If there was no stranger, then who was left? Then came the witness who turned the case. One of Downs's children had survived the shooting but had been left with a serious lasting injury. After months of intensive therapy to regain her speech, her daughter Christy was able to testify at trial. When asked in that courtroom who had shot her, she answered with 2 words. Mom did. She described how her mother had stopped the car, retrieved something, and then shot all 3 of them. A child who had survived the very crime she was describing became the most powerful voice in the room. Combined with the ballistics and the account of Downs's relationship, that testimony was decisive. The stranger in her story had no footprints, no weapon, and now no place to stand. In June 1984, Downs was found guilty of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of first-degree assault. She was sentenced to life plus 50 years, with parole eligibility set decades into the future. Her story did not end at sentencing. In 1987, Downs escaped from an Oregon correctional facility, scaling a fence and evading a wide manhunt for 10 days before being recaptured. The escape added another sentence to the years she already faced. Her 2 surviving children were later adopted by the prosecutor and his wife. Diane Downs, now in her 70s, is held at a women's facility in California. She has been denied parole several times, most recently in October 2025, when the board gave her a 6-year deferral before her next hearing. At that hearing, she maintained that she had not shot her children. The board did not agree, and the daughter's words from 1984 still stand. The next case is one of the most talked about on this list, and the most recent to reach its final chapter. It is a story of a marriage, a divorce, and a courtroom where 2 sisters took opposite sides. Betty Broderick. Her divorce became one of the most talked about cases in the country. And when it ended in a courtroom, 2 of her own daughters walked in to testify on opposite sides. Betty Broderick was born in 1947 in New York. She married Daniel Broderick in 1969 and supported him through medical and law school while she worked as a teacher. Dan went on to become a prominent medical malpractice attorney in San Diego and the president of the County Bar Association. And the couple had 4 children. For years, they were a successful and well-known family, the kind whose life looked settled from the outside. So what turned that life into a public unraveling? The marriage ended, after Dan began a relationship with a younger woman, Linda Kolkina, whom he later married. The divorce that followed was long and bitter, marked by escalating conflict, angry voicemails, and confrontations at Dan's home. It became, for many in San Diego, a story they followed closely as it played out. But few imagined how it would end. On the morning of November 5, 1989, Betty Broderick entered the home of Dan and Linda Broderick using a key. She fired several shots from a revolver, killing both Dan and Linda. She then pulled the phone from the wall, drove to her daughter's home, and afterward turned herself in. The case that followed split her own family down the middle. All four of the Broderick children were caught in the aftermath of losing their father and their stepmother in a single morning. And when the trials came, two of Betty's daughters chose different sides of the courtroom. How does a family survive a moment like that? With one parent gone and the other on trial. At trial, one of Betty's daughters, Kim, testified for the prosecution. She described her mother's planning and her worsening instability in the period before the shootings. Another daughter, Lee, testified for the defense, recounting the frantic moments after the shootings and supporting her mother's account of long-running emotional strain. One family, one tragedy, two daughters on opposite stands. Few cases capture so plainly how a single act can split the people left behind. The first trial in 1990 ended with a hung jury, the jurors unable to agree. At the second trial, in December 1991, Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life. She was later denied parole in 2010 and again in 2017. For more than 3 decades, she remained in custody, and the case stayed in the public eye through books, television, and renewed coverage with each passing year. And this is where the case reaches its most recent and final chapter. In April 2026, Broderick was transferred from her California prison to an outside medical facility after a fall led to broken ribs and serious infection. She died there on May 8, 2026, of what physicians described as natural causes, at the age of 78. 3 of her children were at her bedside, and the 4th joined by video. Her youngest son told a local newspaper that the family chose to remember her at her best, as a fun and intelligent mother who would be missed. The family that her actions divided in a courtroom stood together, in the end, around her. The final case is unlike any other on this list. Here, a child was not a witness against a parent, and not a survivor who testified. Here, a child was pulled into the role of an accomplice. Joseph Kallinger. He ran a shoe repair shop on the ground floor of his home in Philadelphia. He had a family, and he drew one of his own children into a series of crimes across several states. Joseph Kallinger was born in 1935 in Philadelphia. He was placed in foster care as a young child and later adopted. His childhood was marked by severe and documented mistreatment in the adoptive home. He trained as a shoemaker and ran a cobbler shop on the ground floor of his Philadelphia home. He married, and over the years, he had several children. From the street, he was a tradesman with a storefront. Inside, something else was forming. By the mid-1970s, Kallinger was experiencing severe delusions, describing commands he believed he was receiving. He drew one of his sons, Michael, into what would become a series of crimes. A young member of his own household was pulled into the role of an accomplice. How does a parent draw a child into something like that? And how does anyone untangle it afterward? Kallinger's crimes included the loss of a young neighborhood boy and the death of one of his own sons, Joseph Jr., whose body was found at a demolition site. He had taken out a life insurance policy on the boy, though the insurer refused to pay. What kind of plan places a child at the center of it for the sake of a payout? Over a stretch of late 1974 and into January 1975, Callinger and Michael carried out a series of home invasions across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. Posing as salesmen, the pair entered homes, restrained the people inside, and stole cash and valuables. The crimes were escalating, and so was the danger to anyone they encountered along the way. The series reached its end in January 1975 at a home in Leonia, New Jersey, where Callinger held a group of people captive as they arrived. One of the captives, a young nurse named Maria Fasching, lost her life there. Another captive managed to escape and raise the alarm, and neighbors called police. What gave him away was something small and ordinary. Fleeing the scene, Callinger left behind a blood-stained shirt. The shirt carried a laundry mark, and that mark led police to a dry cleaner in Philadelphia who identified Callinger. Joseph and Michael were arrested in January 1975 at the family home in Philadelphia. A piece of clothing, marked and traceable, undid everything a string of crimes across 3 states had not. The role of the child in this case is different from every other on the list. Michael had been pulled into his father's crimes rather than standing against him. He was never called to testify at any of his father's trials. There had also been an earlier complaint from inside the family that did not hold, an opportunity that, had it been acted on, might have changed what followed. Callinger was convicted in 1976 in New Jersey of the killing of Maria Fasching and related charges, and sentenced to life imprisonment. In a separate Pennsylvania case in 1984, he was convicted in the deaths of the young neighborhood boy and of his own son, receiving additional life sentences. Michael was placed in a juvenile facility and, after his release, moved away, joined a foster family, and changed his name to Leave the Case Behind. Callinger spent his later years in psychiatric custody after repeated self-harm attempts. He died in 1996 at a Pennsylvania correctional institution of heart failure following a seizure at the age of 59. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.